Hello, and welcome to Uncodified.
This is our first episode in our series on British constitutionalism.
In this episode, we will first cover the basics of what a constitution is in order to build a foundational knowledge to then go into more specific explorations of the UK constitution later in this series.
Before we embark on our journey through the mysteries of the UK constitution and constitutional history, we will lay out what to expect in this episode and the rest of the series.
This episode, we will introduce the first basic concepts of a constitution and what a constitution is, the difference between uncodified and codified constitutions, and what are the sources of a constitution.
Next week, we will cover the separation of powers, its development and its influence on our political system, and its impact on constitutional thought around the world.
For the third episode, we will look at the rule of law, a key feature of democratic society and the UK specifically.
After these episodes, we will begin an overarching history of the UK constitution from the early evolution of our law and parliament in the early Middle Ages to 1928 when the UK gained universal suffrage.
Following this, we will dive into the modern government, parliament and courts and how they function.
Just a quick disclaimer, before we start the episode, we will be making comparisons using other constitutions, most often with the US Constitution, as it is one of the most influential constitutions in the world and is used as a template for many countries throughout the process of decolonisation.
However, in this particular series, we will be focused on the UK constitution, constitutional law and the constitutional history. So we will not be diving deep into anywhere else around the world too much.
Depending on the success of this series, we might start doing videos or even a series on constitutions around the world and general law and international politics, which we both hope to be able to do so, once we're millionaires and can afford a whole team to help us.
Absolutely. But for now, and now that we have that out of the way, shall we get stuck in?
So, what is a constitution?
Well, I'm glad you asked. A constitution is essentially a rule book for a state. In the words of the UCL Constitutional Unit, a constitution sets the principles by which a state is governed.
Do these rules govern the relationship between the different institutions of a state, the executive, legislature and judiciary, but also between the institutions of the state and the people?
This means that the Constitution delineates our rights and responsibilities as citizens and also dictates some of the rights of non-citizens within the UK system.
So, furthermore, a constitution is a fundamental law which takes precedent over all other types of law, meaning laws cannot surpass it. This is most evident in the US and German constitutions.
Therefore, the Constitution is the highest law of the land. Constitutions can be changed, but it is often a cumbersome process with many checks and balances. This can sometimes cause political issues when the government of the day is limited by it.
A key concept of government is sovereignty. So what is sovereignty, Charla?
Sovereignty is the idea that ultimate power and authority is held in a certain institution within a state. It could be held by a monarch or an institution such as Parliament or in the people of a state. In international politics, sovereignty is understood as a right of a state to govern itself without interference.
So in the UK, sovereignty used to be held solely within the Crown. However, this has changed over time. Today, sovereignty is held by the King in Parliament, with the collective authority of the Crown, House of Lords and Commons, each representing an older idea from Plato of a mixed constitution where power is divided between monarchical, aristocratic and democratic elements. Although in practice today, sovereignty lies with the House of Commons.
An incredibly important thing to understand about our constitution, and in particular, is that as Parliament is sovereign, it is also supreme and can theoretically act however it chooses. We will talk more about this in the next couple of episodes.
So, you might be wondering, why have we called this series Uncodified? Well, there are two types of constitution, codified and uncodified. So what are they, Charla?
Well, let me explain. Constitutions generally fall into two broad categories, codified and uncodified. Sometimes you might also see the terms unwritten and written constitutions instead. However, these terms can be used interchangeably. In this series, we'll use the terms codified and uncodified as we feel that it represents more accurately the reality of constitutions.
This is because an uncodified constitution is not unwritten. It's just written across multiple documents and originates from many different sources which all contribute towards a constitution in a jigsaw puzzle sort of way. This situation would be better described as a constitution that has not been codified or collected in one document, as is the case with the US Constitution.
There are only 3 uncodified constitutions in the world, which shows how rare that form of constitution is. These states are the UK, New Zealand, and Israel.
Looking more deeply into the characteristics of codified and uncodified constitutions, we can find what separates them is the degree to which they can be changed. Academically, this is referred to flexibility and rigidity of a constitution. The flexibility and rigidity of a constitution, thank you, Charla, describes how easy it is for the state to change or amend its constitution. The more flexible a constitution, the easier it is to change. Being a flexible, rigid constitution, I hate you for giving me these lines. So, being a flexible or rigid constitution is not in itself positive or negative, but difficulties can arise in both cases.
An example of how rigidity in a constitution might cause problems can be found in Germany. The German government is restricted in how much it can borrow by its constitution. The government's deficit cannot go above 0.35% of GDP, except in times of emergency. This has recently restricted the government dramatically, as the Federal Audit Court has ruled that the government's attempt to use extra credits designated for COVID recovery to fight climate change was unconstitutional, as the emergency status that allowed the government to expand its deficit did not apply to climate change. The courts ruled that funds for green projects should come from the regular budget. This means that the government now has to find a way to cover a €60 billion hole in its budget, which could lead to spending cuts or tax rises.
On the flip side, the UK Constitution is known for its flexibility. All that is needed is an Act of Parliament to change the Constitution of the UK. Theoretically, a fundamental change in the Constitution could be decided by a simple majority of 1 in the House of Commons. At the time of writing, the Supreme Court unanimously has prevented the government's plan, through the Illegal Migration Act of 2023, to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda. The court ruled that deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda would be in breach of international law, specifically the policy of Vermont found in the 1951 Refugee Convention, which prevents returning people to countries where they would face the risk of persecution because of their race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or their political opinion. This has been interpreted for decades by UK courts as prohibiting indirect return via a third country.
In reaction to this, the government is now attempting to bring a new bill to override the courts, the Safety of Rwanda Bill. This bill declares Rwanda to be a safe country, and so declares Rwanda safe for deporting asylum seekers to, contrary to the Supreme Court's judgment and international law. Aside from obvious human rights issues in this case, this example really raises the question of whether, if this bill is passed, would the Supreme Court have to adhere to the legislation designed to silence it? Whilst the supremacy of Parliament is taken for granted, the other key doctrines of our Constitution, such as the rule of law, also have a deal of authority.
As a result of the Safety of Rwanda Bill, the courts might lose the ability to rule on government actions, which challenges the basic principle of the independence of the judiciary and will be a blatant power grab by the government. How this turns out is a test of whether the Supreme Court, the House of Commons, and the House of Lords can and will check the government as it behaves in a manner that might cause a constitutional crisis in order to break international law.
The unusualness of the UK Constitution. One key aspect of UK constitutional history is the absence of major political revolutions or crises in the last 300 years, which has plagued Europe. For instance, France has had 14 constitutions since 1787, and even the more stable countries, Germany and Italy, have re-established their governments multiple times since their foundation in the mid-19th century. As such, these countries have written, formal, and codified constitutions, whereas the UK has, broadly speaking, evolved its constitution over centuries, which strongly resembles the constitution as it was in 1688.
This was when the last major shift occurred as a result of the British Civil Wars and the so-called Glorious Revolution, where Parliament ousted James II and invited the Dutch stadtholder, King William III, and his wife, James's daughter, Mary II, and limited the power of the crown and required the monarch to be Protestant. But even before the turbulent 17th century, the ancestral roots of our constitutional system can be seen in the medieval era.
So the UK Constitution can initially sound very confusing on the surface, and also below the surface, to be honest. I mean, the iceberg of the UK Constitution would reach the ocean floor. We can generally split the sources of the UK Constitution into 3 categories. Discussed in the next chapter: parliamentary acts, which are legislation and laws, common law, and conventions and other sources.
A part of the reason we are making this series is that the Constitution is just so unclear. What makes the UK Constitution so difficult to decipher is that it's made up of a plethora of sources, including dozens of statutes, hundreds of conventions developed over centuries, and basically an innumerable amount of judicial decisions that shape the conduct of government and the limits of its power. Deciding what laws are fundamental and what laws have no constitutional significance can be an extremely complex and difficult task.
Firstly, let's look at parliamentary acts, which are also known as statutes. These are laws passed by Parliament. The full body of statutes is known as statute law. Basically, all laws passed by Parliament that are in effect.
So some constitutional statutes include the Bill of Rights in 1688, which is the beginning of our modern constitution, the Act of Settlement in 1701, which among other things gave the power to 5 judges to Parliament rather than the King, the Act of Union in 1714, which joined the English and Scottish Parliaments, creating one kingdom, the Parliament Acts 1911 that removed the power of veto from the House of Lords, and the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005, which established the Supreme Court and replaced the House of Lords as the highest court in the UK.
A second huge part of our constitution is common law. For this section, we are going to be using a textbook, Slapper and Kelly's English legal system, to give a simple and maybe oversimplified summary. We tried to write a whole episode on this, but we're leaving it for now.
So, common law is sometimes described as judge-made law. It's an amalgamation of cases in which judges have set precedents on issues from negligence and contracts all the way to the legality of actions of the government.
Common law is slightly paradoxical, as it is firmly based around precedent, but at the same time it is known for having a certain amount of flexibility. As such, judges would interpret the law to fit the facts of individual cases, and so apply the law flexibly without defying set precedents to the given case. Case law itself is the creation and/or the refinement of law through judicial decisions.
The doctrine of binding precedent is known as stare decisis, which is Latin for let the decision stand, because we like to think we're Romans. How this is that within a hierarchical structure of the English courts, decisions made by higher courts are binding on the lower court, and when judges try cases, they will check to see whether a similar situation has previously come before in a higher court and base the decision on that precedent created.
If the precedent was set by a court of equal or higher status to the court deciding the new case, then that judge will follow that precedent. If the case is from a lower court, then the judge is not obliged to follow it, but will seriously consider it.
There are also, for lack of a better word, subcategories of law which are linked but are distinguished from common law, which include equity, which historically operated under a different court system called the Chancery, which was concerned with how the law was applied fairly.
Before the 19th century, most developments in law came by new interpretations of preceding case law.
This is why being uncodified is not the same as being unwritten. There have been cases which have influenced and restrained governments going back centuries, with textbooks written by scholars such as Bracton, Coke, Hale and Blackstone being considered sources of law in their own right, in addition to yearbooks and law reports which record the rulings of judges.
Now, conventions. Conventions are not laws in that they are not legally binding. Instead, conventions are enforced by commonly accepted practices and traditions, which, if broken, would cause a negative response. In short, conventions are the unwritten rules that govern politics.
So the majority of the practices of our system, including the most basic political fact that the Prime Minister has to be able to command a majority in the House of Commons, is not written in law, but merely a convention. The breaking of conventions historically would lead to ministerial resignation, but the resignation of ministers in these situations are themselves conventions. Therefore, a great deal of our constitution is purely reliant on the politicians of the day agreeing to follow convention and to hold those who break them to account and to ostracize those who repeatedly breach them.
Another example of this is the convention that the monarch, as the head of state in the UK, gives their assent to bills proposed by parliaments to make them into law. Theoretically, the monarch has the power to refuse assent, but this has not been done so for 300 years. If the monarch did not assent today, this would cause a constitutional crisis, as it would challenge the supremacy of the House of Commons and broadly be viewed as undemocratic.
A number of conventions that the government ministers are expected to follow have been collected and written into the Ministerial Code. It is a document which lists the conventions that inform ministers how they should behave when in office. As they are not legally binding, the enforcement of this is reliant on the Prime Minister, and if political pressure does not arise and the Prime Minister chooses not to enforce, there will be little recourse if the minister broke the convention.
One of these conventions is that ministers must appear before Parliament to answer questions and to allow themselves to be held to account. This is written as follows in the 2022 Ministerial Code. It is of paramount importance that ministers give accurate and truthful information to Parliament, correcting any inadvertent error at the earliest opportunity. Ministers who knowingly mislead Parliament will be expected to offer their resignation to the Prime Minister.
If a minister would refuse to do so or break any part of the Ministerial Code, that would be seen as subversion of the convention and expectation of proper behaviour, and could end up in the worst case the resignation of that minister, or for junior ministers the loss of potential opportunities such as the cabinet minister, and in very worst conditions possible, in some cases MPs have been suspended and removed from the House of Commons.
Not all conventions are important for our constitution. For example, before 1998, an MP who wished to raise a point of order in the Commons had to wear a top hat. And I think we can all agree that the removal of this convention does not damage our system of government. Unless you do, in which comment in the comments section below.
So, other sources of our Constitution are authoritative works and international law. Works of authority are books written mostly in the 19th century, which lay out how the English or British Constitution works. Some good examples which we will be using are Erskine's May, a treatise upon the law, privileges and proceedings and usage of Parliament, which we just call Erskine May from here on out because it's an extremely long title, but it's frequently referred to by the speakers and the clerks of the Commons. Walter Baggett's The English Constitution, and A.V. Dicey's Introduction to the Study of the Law of the Constitution.
And lastly, the final source of the UK Constitution comes from international law and agreements. One such agreement the UK is party to is the European Convention on Human Rights, which was legislated to the Council of Europe in 1951. The UK ratified the principles of the European Convention of Human Rights into UK domestic law through the 1998 Human Rights Act, which came into force in 2000.
So now you know what a constitution is. Please like and comment and any questions you have, and please, if you would be so generous, share, and we will be with you next week for the separation of powers.
We hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we enjoyed making it. In the next episode, our journey through the dark mists of the UK Constitution takes us to murkier lands. We will be investigating the separation of powers. We'll be quoting from such figures as Locke, Montesquieu and Blackstone, which was a struggle as it lived in a time before proper grammar was invented. So until then, have a great week, and we'll see you next time on Uncodified.
Goodbye, guys.
Like and subscribe if you don't want to be haunted by the House of Commons top hat.